Cool.
All right. Cool. Thank you, Tim. Yeah, so let me first introduce myself to everyone. My name is Ryan Liang. I've been helping your team out with your PayScan implementation process. And like what Tim just said earlier, this session today is going to be our data entry session. And I'll be showing you folks how we're able to scan our invoices, get them in our system, and how we kickstart them in the workflow process. I know your team is using something called full service. And for those of you folks who don't know what full service is, it's basically the invoice outsourcing agreements that we have with Yardi. So that basically means most of your invoices will be going to full service. Full service is going to do data entry for you folks and then import them into procure to pay. But I feel like it is still really important.
How are you guys doing?
Jillian,
is everything live on your end?
All right, Jillian, I just muted you.
Yep.
Anyways, so full service is going to be dealing with most of your data entry and then importing them into your system. However, I feel like it is still important for you guys to know how to do data entry, how to get your invoices in the system, because occasionally there's going to be some emergency invoices that you just need to pay really quickly. And there is typically a 3-day business day turnaround for full service to process the invoice. And we are recording right now, by the way, but let me show you guys how our data entry process and how the import process is going to work. So what we're seeing on my screen right now, this is procure to pay. So this is that paperless AP system that we were really excited to bring to you guys. Now, in order to access procure to pay, you're going to have to log in through Yardi 1. And once you log into Yardi 1, you're going to see a module called Elevate Production. And once you select Elevate Production, you're going to select the live database or the test database, and then it's going to bring you to this procure to pay dashboard that we're looking at. Now, this main dashboard is going to display all of your open transactions. So an open transaction is any transaction that has not yet been posted and or has not been also paid for or processed. Payment has not been processed for it. So this can include any transaction that has been freshly imported, any invoice that is in the middle of the workflow process, basically any invoice that hasn't been posted or paid for. Now, at any point in time, if you want to find all of your transactions in the system, not just the open ones, you can do so by clicking the PayScan button at the very top of the screen, selecting Invoice, and then selecting Search IR or Search Invoice Register. Now from here, you can use the filters at the very top half of the screen. If you need additional filters, you can click more and use these filters to actually find all the transactions that are within your system, not just your final open transactions. Now, the database we'll be working out of today during our demonstration is going to be our PayTest database, which is a special test database that I created for our procure to pay implementation. It is an exact mirror of your live database. So you're going to see a lot of information that's very familiar, such as your vendor properties, etc. So don't worry, this is all test environments, even though it looks eerily familiar. Now, looking at this main dashboard over here, first thing that probably catches your eyes are going to be these 4 boxes at the very top half of the screen. These boxes will display a pie chart, except the 4th one over here. But these three boxes will display a pie chart with a breakdown of roughly what percentage of your open transactions fall under certain invoice statuses, invoice expense types, and due dates. So a quick glance, you can see roughly, let's say 55% of my transactions are currently ready for data entry, and about 45% of my transactions are currently in the middle of the workflow process. So at a quick glance, yeah.
Just a quick question. What does that mean? If it says it's ready for entry or workflow in progress, what does that actually mean?
Good question. So ready for entry means the invoice has not officially kickstarted in the workflow process. So this typically happens when your invoice has been freshly imported in the system and you have not actually selected a workflow for that transaction. Now, when full service imports an invoice into your system, they are going to select a workflow. So for most of your invoices, you're going to see the status in progress. And then workflow in progress means you've officially kickstarted the workflow progress.
So does that mean every data entry person is going to see all these properties here?
No, depending on what property what property they are limited to seeing within Voyager under their user settings. So if a user is supposed to see a single property, they will just see their single property on this dashboard over here.
Okay, I just want to make sure because sometimes there's two different types of security settings, so I just want to make sure.
Yeah, so Voyager does the Voyager property user property security settings will dictate what shows up on this dashboard. And this is a great transition to kind of talk about how procure to pay kind of works with Voyager. So procure to pay and Voyager are actually on separate platforms, but even though they are on separate platforms, the two platforms do talk to each other. So whatever invoice that you upload in procure to pay is going to show up immediately inside the Voyager environment. So this means that if I had a second tab opened over here within Voyager, and I were to upload an invoice, if I were to go to that Voyager tab and refresh it, that transaction would actually immediately show up in that Voyager tab. There's no delay. I don't have to wait for a task to run or anything like that. And this works vice versa as well. Let's say I added a new vendor within Voyager. If I were to refresh this Procure to Pay tab, that vendor would immediately show up within Procure to Pay as well. So even though we're separate platforms, we're still in the Yardi ecosystem. Everything is connected. Everything talks to each other. Now, if we take a look at the bottom half of the screen over here, again, this is all your open transactions, and you're going to have all of the details, such as the vendors, the invoice, the property. Again, this information is typically going to be filled out already by your full service team. You will notice transactions 8 through 12 over here don't have any information keyed in. And then that was some invoices that I uploaded earlier before our call today just to do some testing. And because it's not imported by full service, I'm going to have to key in the information manually. And I'll show you folks how we're going to be able to do that a little bit later. Now, this search bar at the very top of the screen.
Ryan?
Yeah.
I just wanted to pause for a second here, and I'm guessing that potentially Susan doesn't know yet what you mean by full service. Can you just give her a kind of a brief overview of what you mean when you say full service?
Yeah. So full service is an agreement with it's like an agreement with Yardi Systems that our full service team is going to be receiving the invoices directly from the vendors. And once our full service team receives those invoices, they are going to actually do the data entry of those invoices. Once they complete the data entry, they are then going to import them into your procure to pay environments. So this way, your team is able to allocate time doing more important tasks than data entry. And all you folks have to do is actually review the invoice imported by full service, make sure the information is keyed in correctly, and then move it through the workflow approval process and get that final approved.
Okay, thanks. So Susan, it's probably pretty clear at this point, but it's basically kind of like having online vendors in a sense where the invoices are electronic and they get put in automatically, if you remember that from ops.
Do you remember?
Yeah. And this search bar at the very top is going to allow us to filter out what transactions or what open transactions are displayed at the bottom half of the screen. So a very common issue that I see with other clients, other users, is that the created from dates and created to dates, they are not filled in correctly. And if that's the case, your transactions are not going to show up on the bottom half of the screen. So please do make sure the date range is filled out correctly. Now, if you want additional filters, you can actually click that more drop down, and that is going to display additional filters that you can use to find your invoices that are within the system.
I have a question. So when you said by created, that's when it's submitted, it's not necessarily by the date on the invoice?
When you submit it, oh, you mean this date over here,
Yeah,
correct?
that's the
Yeah, so
date?
So this is going to be the creation date, which is going to be the date that the invoice was imported in the system.
Okay. Is there a way to filter by invoice date?
Invoice dates right here.
Okay, so there it is.
Invoice date from, invoice date to.
Okay. And I also have another question. You were
Yes.
talking about how you could create the vendor in Yardi, and then you can refresh and it will show up in procure to pay.
Yeah.
So what if I wanted restrictions on which properties can access the vendor code? Is that
Which
doable
properties? Which properties have access to the
to a vendor
different?
code? Yeah.
That's a good question. Let me do some research on that. From the top of my head, I'm not 100% sure. Let me make a note. Okay.
And I'm forgive me for popping in. I don't know the exact workflow for today. I just wanted to verify when we think about getting invoices processed, like inevitably we think, oh, well, there has to be some sort of like work order, started first, or not work order, like a WTN, some sort of like preliminary input to expect the invoice. Like, is that going to be part of this training too?
So it's purchase orders. So
Purchase orders.
Ryan, are we going to do purchase orders in this training?
Yes, we will. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll be back.
All right. Okay, so I'll do some research to see if there's a way we can limit which users have access, which properties have access to certain vendors, and I'll get back to you on that. All right, cool. Okay, so this is our main dashboard over here. Now, your process, you guys are first going to start with purchase orders. So we're going to create purchase orders. And the great thing about purchase orders is that when they are synced to your invoice, they can actually pre-populate a lot of the information from the purchase order directly onto the invoice itself. But let me show you guys how that process is going to work. So if we go up to the very top toolbar, click on PayScan, there is going to be a purchase order subcategory. If I select purchase order, I do have the option to click on add PO. Once I select that, it's going to bring me to a blank PO page. And this is where I can actually begin populating the information regarding my purchase order. Now, you will notice that some of these fields will have red asterisks next to them. And what those red asterisks will mean is that these fields will have to be populated before the system will allow us to save the purchase order in the system. So our first mandatory field is going to be the vendor field. That's pretty self-explanatory. That's going to be the vendor associated with the transaction. Now, the system does have AJAX, meaning if you begin typing out specific letters, phrases, the system is going to display a box with the predicted vendor that it thinks you want to populate the field with. So this is an example. So I'm just going to make things up. So we have our vendor selected. The next field that we have to select is something called an expense type. And if I click this triple dot icon, you can see that we currently have about 10-ish different expense types that are within the system. So depending on what purchase order or what kind of purchase order you are creating, you are going to select the expense type associated with it. Now, the easiest way to think of what an expense type is, it's basically a category that your transaction will fall under. So when we created these expense types, we tried to make them as simple to understand as possible. But if there are some questions, please feel free to ask. The preliminary expense type is reserved for full service, so don't worry too much about that. There's no need to select that. But everything else should be hopefully pretty easy to associate with the different transactions coming into the system.
Can I just pause this here really quick?
Yeah.
Do we have anywhere a list of which kinds of expenses should go into these different types?
Yeah, it depends on what we did for the GL code. So I think I did the expense type security that only allows the properties I don't know if it's users, I think, to only
security groups.
Yeah, security groups. Yeah, so I believe I only had the capital majors, the other, and property expenses. Those should be the only three that the property should be using. And it depends on what, the GL code. So for example, all of our major and all the GL codes is 1600 and all the GL codes 56. Our capital majors, the property expenses are pretty much like the repair costs, your contracts, services. I'm trying to think of something else. And then other is going to be just for water intrusion. Yeah.
Is it only for water intrusion?
I believe it is. I could go look, but I think it's only just for water intrusion. At least, like I said, I copied the different settings from Ops Technology, because on Ops Technology, the site team was not able to see the expense type because that was in the back end. This one's a little Yardi or Procure Pay is a little different now. The expense type is visible, and that will dictate the GL codes that they can use, and also the workflow of where the invoice is going to be routed to.
Okay. So it sounds like on-site users aren't going to see nearly this many categories.
Yeah, they shouldn't.
And if somebody is not sure which category they should select at the front end, what would be the best way for them to proceed? Should they try to find out first, or give it their best guess and then they can change it later? Or what would you recommend there?
Well, if the GL code they want to use doesn't show up, then they're using the wrong one,
Okay.
because the GL codes are limited to that particular group. So if they're
If you
saying,
select
oh,
something here and then you go and try to make your PO and the GL that you need isn't there, it might mean come back here, pick a different category, and then go back and the GL should be there.
yeah,
Okay. Thanks.
All right, so for today's demonstration, I'm just going to select a property expense. We'll keep things nice and generic. Now at the bottom half of the screen, this is going to be the detail information for our purchase order. You can see our first mandatory field is going to be the property. Again, like before, the system does have Ajax, and it will populate. A dropdown is going to show up with the property ID we typed in. If there's a unit item type, feel free to pop in information not necessary, as there's no red star next to it. Description field is where we can type in a short description. Test detail line. And then a GL account is going to be the GL accounts associated with the purchase orders. Cool thing about the system is you can begin typing out the GL account name, and the system is going to display all the general ledger accounts with that phrase that you typed in there. And of course, quantity order is the quantity order, and the unit price is going to be the price per unit. Now, if you need to, oh, just kidding, you just have one standard display type, so that's good. All right, so once you have that start information filled out, all you gotta do is click that save button, and that is going to actually officially save your purchase order in the system. Now, you guys are not using workflows for your purchase orders or anything like that, so once you click that save button, that purchase order is going to be saved in the system and ready to be synced over to your invoices within Procure to Pay. Now, if we take a look at the left-hand side of the screen, there are some tabs over here. PO info is this basic screen that you'll be working out of most of the time. Workflow history tab, don't worry about this. You are not going to be using workflows. General info is just going to be some basic information regarding your purchase order. If you want the system to print your notes, that's going to be notes over here in the description field. If you want to show up in your printed form, please make sure that print notes box is checked. Addresses is going to display your bill to and ship to information. Don't worry about the approvers tab over here. This is reserved for if you are using workflows for your purchase orders. This budget tab is going to show you the budget of your property in relationship to the GL account and whether or not you're currently over budget for that. Now, audit history over here is going to show us all of the historical purchase order changes for this purchase order. So if a user has ever made any adjustments, that information is going to be logged over here. If you need to add any attachments, you are more than welcome to add those attachments on the purchase order over here as well. And flag attachments, don't worry about this tab over here. This is not being used as of now. And then emails sent is going to will actually show a list of all the emails that have been sent out from this purchase order. So if we go to the PO info tab, there is going to be an email button right over here. And if you were to email this out, that is going to update the email sent. So everyone is able to see which email address you sent this purchase order out to. Now, the receiving feature is completely optional, but if you actually use this feature, you're able to receive the items into inventory, and that just marks that, hey, the vendor has delivered the service or good And in order to receive, all you would have to do is click that receive PO box at the very right-hand side, choose the quantity received, and then click save to acknowledge that you have received the service or good.
Quick question, does
yeah.
the receive function affect anything? Like, will we not be able to do something downstream if we don't receive it?
No, so it's completely optional. The only thing
Okay.
that receiving does is that it will affect your inventory module within Voyager if you guys are using the inventory feature in Voyager.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. And don't worry about custom tables over here. You guys will not be using this right now. It's for customizations on the back end. So via special customizations, we'll revisit this if necessary. But that's a purchase order. And the beauty of a purchase order is that when you sync this PO to your invoice, it is going to pre-populate your invoice with that information from the purchase order. So you do not have to actually do double the amount of data entry if you were to have already created a purchase order in the system. Now, full service, when they key in the information on your invoice, if they see a PO number attached to that invoice image, they will also sync over that PO number to the transaction when they import it into your system. So you guys will not have to do that for most of the transactions unless your vendor forgot to include a PO number or if full service is unable to locate that PO number in your system.
Ryan?
Yeah.
So this is a snafu that happens sometimes where currently, right, we have a similar full service thing. The team member, when they're creating the PO, will just only have everything as like a one line and not split it out. But then on the actual invoice, the vendor should split it out. But then when they merge, they try to resolve the invoice and the PO, they'll default to the one-liner.
I see.
So can we avoid that, or how will we fix it?
So full service, when they import the invoice in the system, they will actually, if they see a PO number, they will just sync over that PO number. They do not physically do any data entry. So what shows up on that PO is going to be how the invoice is imported in your system, the line item.
Okay, so that's on a training level, we just have to ensure that the team members do not try to take any shortcuts.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes, you're correct.
You catch that, Tim?
Yes, I caught that. And for anybody else listening who might be entering these, the main thing is just enter the PO information as you would for an invoice, you know, just being as detailed and accurate as possible, just because that is what will show up on the invoice. So
yeah, and I can tell you from doing invoice approvals the past couple months, not everybody is doing it the right way.
Yeah, so yeah, try to get in the habit of doing that, guys. All right. Now that we have our purchase order created, the next thing we're going to do is actually import our invoice into the system manually. And again, full service is going to be doing this for most of the transactions. I will let you guys know at what point in time full service typically ends their process a little bit later. So we're going to head to our procure to pay dashboard, our main dashboard that we saw earlier. So I've taken an invoice, I put it in my scanner. Yeah.
I was wondering if it's possible that we could go through maybe revising a PO.
Revising PO, absolutely. So if a purchase order has not been synced over to a invoice yet,
and the syncing over it's like automatic. Like if the invoice is already in there, it just automatically syncs, or
we have to we actually have to let the system know that, hey, this invoice should be synced to PO blah blah blah, and it will carry over the PO to that invoice. But again, full service will typically be doing that for you.
okay.
Yeah, but to make modifications to the purchase order, if you add additional lines or anything like that, all you would have to do is just type it in over here, click save, and that is going to allow you to actually add additional lines in the system. If the purchase order line is already synced to an invoice, I don't believe it's going to allow you to delete it. It's going to throw you a hard stop, letting you know that it has been attached to an invoice. And in order to remove that line from the purchase order is to actually unsync that line from the invoice before trying again.
Can they just adjust the invoice itself?
You cannot, well, you can adjust the invoice itself, but it's not going to adjust the purchase order.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
What if they need to change like the vendor code?
Vendor code on the invoice or on the invoice?
On the PO. Is that possible to change the vendor on the PO?
after it has been synced to an invoice?
Before. So
Yeah, so you should be able to, yes, unless it throws you a hard stop. I don't think it's gonna throw you a hard stop. So right now we're not synced to anything, but right now if I want to change a vendor, I totally could.
okay. And then
Yes.
changing the property is also an option because like we have some community managers managing multiple properties at one time and occasionally they enter it underneath the wrong property.
Yeah, changing the property is fine. Now if it's already synced to an invoice, it might cause some issues though. But if it's not synced to an invoice, it will allow you to make changes to the property.
And so like say someone creates a PO and it might take what, 24 hours before it gets synced? If like an invoice is coming, like if the invoice is in the system and then the PO is in the system, but then we're waiting for, I guess, Yardi to sync it, it might be 24 hours.
It's at least a 3 business day turnaround for full service. And that's why it's important for me to show you guys how to do the data entry for invoices yourself, just in case for those emergency transactions.
Okay, so look at 3 days.
Yeah,
Okay.
3 business days, yeah.
And just one thing to highlight here too is that the ideal process is that POs are getting entered into the system when orders are happening. And that could be, you know, a week or more before an invoice comes in. And so it's not like just you're automatically going to have a PO synced as soon, you know, 3 business days after you create it, just because there may not be an invoice for it to sync to yet. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
One thing I'd be concerned is just want to make sure that all the properties are then creating the POs beforehand.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Stress the importance of that.
Yep.
All right. Any other questions regarding purchase orders? All right, so let's talk more about invoices now. So I want to show you guys how we're able to get our invoice into the system if we want to bypass full service. Let's say your vendor sends you an email or even snail mails you an invoice. They say, hey, for some reason this was missed. Can you get us paid within 2 days? Well, with full service, there's that 3-day turnaround. So we can't send it to them to basically meet that 2-day cutoff. So we're going to be importing this invoice into the system ourselves. In order to get this invoice into the system, our invoice has to follow 3 rules. First rule is that the invoice itself has to be in PDF format, cannot be anything else. Second rule is that the invoice or invoices cannot exceed larger than 10 megabytes. And the third and final rule is that when we save the invoice on our computer, we just have to make sure there are no special characters such as $signs, @signs, basically nothing unconventional that we typically wouldn't use when saving something on our desktop. So I've taken the liberty of scanning an invoice, saving it on my computer. I'm not going to show you that process because if you guys have ever scanned and saved a document your entire life, you guys already know how that process works. Nothing's going to change in that department. You guys don't have to get a special scanner as well. Whatever scanner you guys currently use will be sufficient for that process. So I have the invoice saved on my computer. In order to get that invoice or invoices opened up, I'm going to click that PayScan button at the very top, select invoice, and then I am going to click on Import IR or Import Invoice Register. Now, I'm going to click the Open PDF button at the very right-hand side of the screen, and that's going to open my File Explorer. So from my File Explorer, I'm going to find my location of where I save the invoice or invoice images. So we can see on my screen, I have several different demo invoices. And when it comes to saving these invoices on my computer, I do have two different options. And there isn't a best practice on how I should save my invoices. It's going to be completely up to personal preference. So the first way to save your invoices is to save each individual invoice into their own separate PDF files. So you can see my ACE demo 1 through 6. That represents 6 individual invoices. On the other hand, I can save my invoices as a single PDF file over here with multiple invoices. So if we take a look at my sample invoices file, this file contains 6 individual invoices. No best practice. It's going to be completely up to your personal preference on how you want to save your invoices. If I do happen to save my invoices into separate PDF files, I can actually open up multiple files by holding the control key on my keyboard and then selecting whatever files I want to open up. Now, for today's demonstration, I'm going to open up my sample invoices file. And again, this single file contains 6 individual invoices. So I'm going to select that. I'm going to click open at the very bottom right-hand side of my screen. And that is going to actually cause the system to think for a second and then open up the invoice on the list over here, the right-hand side. So you can see I have 1_1 all the way through 1_6. And those 1 through 6 represent the 6 invoices that I just uploaded in the system. Now, at the very beginning, you'll see something called a transaction ticket. You're going to hear me call it a transaction barcode page. But this transaction barcode page lets the system know where the individual transactions are in a single batch of invoices. So because I have 6 individual invoices, by the time I leave this page, I should have 6 of these transaction barcode pages in front of all 6 invoices. So to get these barcode pages inserted into the correct locations, I do have several tools at my fingertips. And I'm gonna let you guys know in what scenarios I would recommend using what tools as best practice a little bit later on. But the first option is a separator option at the very top right-hand side of the screen. If I click this separator option, the system is going to automatically insert a transaction barcode page in front of every individual page. So because I had 6 individual pages, I have 6 of these barcode pages inserted of all 6 pages. Now, for example purposes, let's say page 5_1 and 6_1. Let's say they are a single 2-page invoice. Well, because they are a single 2-page invoice, I need to remove this barcode page in between them because at this point in time, the system thinks they are in fact separate transactions. So to remove the barcode page, I'm going to make sure that barcode page is selected on the list. And then I'm going to take my mouse, move it to the right-hand side where there's a green check mark that says merge. And if I click that merge button, the system is going to remove that barcode page in between them. And now we are in fact looking at a single 2-page transaction as our final transaction on the list. Now let's say I accidentally remove that barcode page. And these are in fact supposed to be separate transactions. Well, if I want to insert a barcode page in front of a transaction, I just need to make sure it is selected on the list. Again, take my mouse, move it to the right-hand side where you'll see there's a double arrow icon that says insert. And when I click that insert button, the system is going to insert that barcode page right in front of that invoice that I have selected. So now we are in fact looking at 6 individual transactions. Now with these tools at your fingertips, I'm going to let you guys know in what scenarios I would recommend using what as best practice. Scenario 1, all or most of your invoices are single-page invoices. As best practice, I'm going to recommend you use that separator button and just manually remove the barcode pages where they don't belong by making sure that barcode page is selected on the list, and then using that green check mark merge button. Scenario 2, your invoice page numbers are all over the place. If that's the case, as best practice, I'm going to say do not use that separator button and instead just go down the list and manually insert the barcode pages in front of the transactions you want to have separated by using the double arrow icon that says insert. And the reason I recommend these options as best practice for different scenarios is because sometimes if your page numbers are all over the place and you were to use that separator button, sometimes it requires you to provide in more work to remove all the barcode pages where they don't belong than if you were to have inserted them into the correct locations in the first place manually. Are there any questions regarding the barcode pages and how they function within the system?
I have a question. If we scan a PDF with multiple pages and we already put this separator page, is it going to show up and register the separation once it's scanned or once the system scans it?
Good question. So this barcode page, do not make a copy of this. Do not scan it into your invoice when you're importing the invoice in the system, because if you do that, the system is not going to recognize it as a barcode page. It is going to think it is part of your invoice. We need the system to generate this barcode page, or it's not going to recognize it as a barcode page. But on a side note, if you were to save your invoices into their own separate PDF files, the system is going to actually put their transaction barcode page in front of every individual PDF file that you opened up. So for example, I have HTML 1 through 6. If I open all 6 of them like this and click open, the system is going to automatically insert 6 barcode pages in front of all 6 PDF files because it thinks that each of those files is in fact a separate transaction.
That's useful. Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions? All right. Now I'll talk a little bit about the blue box over here, the top right-hand side, and this gray box at the very bottom right-hand side of the screen. I just want to start off by saying that both of these fields are completely optional, but this blue box at the very top right-hand side will allow you to populate information such as the payee, property, and/or expense type, and it's going to apply to all of the transactions listed below. So great tool if you have multiple invoices all under the same property, let's say. Gray box at the very bottom right-hand side, also completely optional. It will allow you to begin populating information for our transaction. All you would have to do is make sure the correct transaction is selected. You can begin populating information over here, hop to your second transaction, do the same thing, and then continue down the line. You do not have to populate the information at this point in time. If you don't, the system is going to provide you the same exact information as well as other information at a later point in time. And that's when I usually do it myself. Now, once you have confirmed there's a barcode page in front of every individual transaction, you can then begin the import process by clicking that import batch button. System's going to think for a second or two, and then it's going to provide you a batch ID number for reference. So once you see that batch ID number, that means your invoice has officially been imported in the system, and then you can properly dispose of your paper invoices. Now, to see those transactions, I'm going to head back to that Procure to Pay dashboard. Make sure my filters are correct, and then I can see at the very bottom over here we have our invoice ID number, invoice batch number 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's 6 of them over here, and if you just recall, I just uploaded 6 invoices in the system. If I want to filter out by certain invoices, I can use this mini search bar over here, and that is going to allow me to filter out by that batch number. Now, I want to show you guys how we're able to do some data entry. So let's drill into our first invoice ID number over here, invoice ID number 13, and that is going to actually bring us to our transaction.
Actually, I was wondering if we could go back to the searching for what you uploaded. Because I've in the past been asked to like verify that a property was able to successfully upload it. And I would need to be able to filter by the property and possibly the person who supposedly sent it. Oh, okay. So that would be right up there then?
Yeah, there's a property
Okay.
field over here somewhere. Is it created by? And there's a property field over here.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Just need to make sure.
Yeah, don't worry. Yeah, it's all there.
All right. That's it. Thanks.
If we take a look at our invoice ID, we can see our invoice image at the very right-hand side of the screen. And if I kind of move my mouse over it, you do have the automatic magnifying feature. If you do want to disable it, you can click the eye icon. That is going to disable it. And of course, you click that plus sign and minus sign to zoom in and zoom out as well. Now, like our purchase order, you'll see that there's some red asterisks over here. And that basically means that those are mandatory fields. Now, because we have a purchase order created already, what I'm going to recommend is you sync that purchase order over to this invoice before you continue doing any data entry. The reason I recommend that is, again, because when you sync that purchase order over to the invoice, it is going to pre-populate all that information from the purchase order to your invoice. If you don't do that and you do the data entry first, it's just a waste of your time, and it's not using purchase orders to the max efficiency.
Hey, Ryan, quick question on that.
Yeah.
If you were to pre-populate the invoice data here and then sync it, will the purchase order information overwrite what you've done? Or have you just potentially typed in more things that you didn't need to, but it'll keep what you typed in?
It will keep what you typed in and it will sync over the line items from that purchase order.
What if you type in line items from the invoice and then you sync it to the purchase order? Will it adjust anything that you've done on your line items?
Will it change the purchase order? Is that what you're saying, or will it change the invoice?
Let me give you a scenario and then you can tell me how it might play out. Let's imagine that I put in a purchase order and on that purchase order, there was only one line item, but in reality, that one line item included things that might potentially go into different GL codes.
Mhm.
And then I get the invoice for it. And the invoice has everything broken out more to a more granular level. If I take that invoice and I type in, let's say, 3 lines from the invoice, and then I sync it to that PO.
You sync the invoice to the PO, or you sync the PO to an invoice?
Gosh, is it different?
You don't. The system will not allow you to sync an invoice to a PO. It will allow you to sync a PO to an invoice.
Okay, so
Yeah.
I've done that now.
Yeah.
Will it overwrite the lines that I put in on that invoice with the one line that was on the PO?
It will not override anything on the invoice. It will just add the line from the PO to the invoice.
Okay, so you just have to make sure that there's no duplicate in there then?
Exactly. So that's why I say, as best practice, I'm going to recommend you sync that PO immediately before you begin keying in information.
Okay, that makes
Yeah.
sense. Thanks.
Yep. Yep. And just a quick disclaimer, folks, we are running a little bit late on time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to schedule a general Q&A, let's say at 4:15 p.m. today. So let's hold off the questions for now, and I'll send over a link for a general Q&A, and you folks can jump in, ask any questions about the demonstration that comes up. Just because we're running a little bit short on time for our course today, or this session today. All right, so if there's a purchase order number for this transaction, what we're going to do is we're going to sync it to this transaction by using the link PO button or this purchase order button at the very top left-hand side of the screen. So if you're trying to sync over all the detail lines from the purchase order, I'm going to recommend you just plop that PO number over here. And what's that going to do is it's going to sync over all the detail lines from that purchase order to this invoice. Now, if you want a little bit more control and you want to sync specific lines from the purchase order to the invoice, I would recommend you use the link PO button for the individual line items. And this is going to allow you to sync over individual lines to the invoice, which is going to allow you to kind of fine tune what items from that purchase order are brought over to the invoice. Now, that purchase order that I just created earlier was PO number 1. So if I select PO number 1 over here, you will notice that it will automatically populate the information from that purchase order when I synced it over to this invoice. We have the vendor, we have the expense type, we have the details section at the very bottom half of the screen populate. What it doesn't populate is going to be the invoice number and the total amounts. Invoice number does not automatically populate because it's the purchase order did not have an invoice number attached to it. The total amount does not populate because the system wants you to physically type in a total amount before it allows you to move the invoice forward to the workflow process. And the reason for that is because sometimes folks just sync over purchase orders. They don't take a look at the detailed line information. So just from trial and error, we discovered during the initial testing that if we had users physically type in a total amount in the header section, it cuts down the amount of mistakes when purchase orders are synced over to invoices. So as a data entry user, you will need to fill out the invoice number, the total amounts. And once you have that information filled out, what you're going to do is you are going to click the save button over here. And once you click that save button, you will notice the workflow will update with some information. So when I click that save button, you will notice that workflow has updated to expense invoice workflow, status is in process, and the current step is data entry. So once you see the status update to in process and the current step update to data entry, that means we've officially kickstarted the workflow process, and we're officially on the first step of our workflow process. Yeah, so at this point in time, this is actually where full service stops. So full service will key in the information. They will not key in the GL account number field. though. So take into account the GL account is not going to be filled out. However, if there is a GL account on the purchase order, that field is going to automatically fill out for them. But full service is going to import the invoices. It's going to stop on the data entry step. And then from that point, it's going to be up to your responsibility as a team to move that invoice from the data entry step to the next step of the workflow process. So in order to move the invoice to the next step of the workflow process, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click that next step dropdown. And from this next step dropdown, I'm going to choose the appropriate option. Most of you folks will not see that final approve option, but your next step dropdown probably is going to be different than mine. Now, no matter what shows up in your next step dropdown, you should have an option to move it forward, and then you should have an option to reject the invoice. Obviously, if the invoice is good, you would choose the step that's above you in the workflow process, and then you would click save or save and next. Both options are going to acknowledge that this invoice is going to move up to the next step that you have selected. However, what happens after that is going to slightly differ. Save button again is going to move it to the next step that we have selected. However, the system is going to stay on this specific screen. It's not going to navigate to a different menu. It's going to stay on this specific invoice. Save and next is also going to move the invoice to the next step that we have in the dropdown. However, it is also going to do the courtesy of moving our next invoice that we just imported to our screen. So in my example, I uploaded 6 invoices. If I'm trying to quickly power through all 6 invoices and do data entry, that save and next button might be the most efficient tool when trying to quickly do the data entry for all the invoices. You're going to find out what works best in what scenarios once you get your hands on the software. So that's just a kind of a thing you have to encounter and get your hands on. If I need to write notes for my folks in the next step, I can write notes over here. And when I click save or save and next, the folks in the next step will be notified of these notes. Now this rejection option over here, it's basically going to be the equivalent of the delete button or do not process. If you discover that you no longer need to process this invoice, choose that rejection option, and then it will remove the invoice from the workflow process. Now, you guys, I believe, do not have access to the delete button. So if you ever need to get rid of something, please just reject that invoice and treat it as a delete option. This top section over here is our milestone dropdown. This is going to display some of the important milestones that this invoice has gone through during its life cycle. It'll let you know when it was imported, the workflow steps that I completed, and all the way to who cut the check at what date and what time. Yep.
Is there an opportunity to add additional items or backup to an invoice? Because currently that is part of our workflow at certain roads require.
Add a backup, so, add a contract, you mean?
Yeah, like a signed contract or maybe a lien waiver, that type of thing. Like where would we add extra stuff?
Yeah, so if you want to attach something to the transaction, there is an attachments button at the very left-hand side of the screen. And if you click on attachments, you can click on choose files, and that is going to allow you to add attachments to the invoice.
And where does the attachments live on that actual just like invoice page?
They're not going to show up over here. If you want to view all attachments, they can be clicked over here, and those attachments are going to show up over here.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Okay. Yep. And these tabs on the left-hand side over here are going to be very similar to what we saw with our purchase orders. Pay info is going to be our vendor information. Now, workflow history is going to be more applicable for our invoices since our invoices are going to go through a workflow approval process. That workflow approval process will guarantee that all the approvers have viewed the transaction, have basically confirmed it is correct and needs to be processed. And this workflow history tab is going to show us which users took action on what date and what time. The approvers are the recognized users who are able to participate in the current workflow step. Budgets is what we discussed before. Audit history is going to show us which user made what changes to the invoice at what date and what time. Attachments is going to allow you to add attachments and shows attachments. Notification sent is like that emailing history for our purchase orders, it's going to show that historical email history. And then we're going to ignore custom tables over here unless we have special customizations, which I will then talk about a little bit later. And then user settings at the very bottom over here is customizable personal settings at an individual level. So if you want your header section, that's this overview section, to always be collapsed or showing whenever you open up an invoice, you can adjust this setting. And then the image location setting over here dictates what happens to this invoice image on the right-hand side of the screen, if you want to be docked or undocked. And then the magnifier is what happens to this magnifying feature if you want disabled or not showing. All right, so it's cutting a little close to 2:30. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to forward a meeting invite to Francisco and Tim. And Francisco and Tim, if you guys can send this to the attendees, let them know that if there's any questions, you guys are able to join that general Q&A, and I can help clarify things. Any questions starting at 4:15. Any questions or concerns so far, the minute we have left?
No, just if we're in the next session, we have to link in fresh to the next one. Is that it?
Correct. Yeah,
Okay.
the next session is going to be in a separate room.
Okay.
Great. Okay. All right. I'll see you guys in a separate room then. Thank you all. Take care.